If we open this new and improved version of phonebook.html, notice a few things. In the head of my page, I've included a link tag this time, but it's not referring to a file of my own, like styles.css from before, but rather it's referring to an absolute URL that ultimately, per the end of this URL, points to a file somewhere in the cloud called bootstrap.min.css, where min is just saying that this is a minified file, which means a lot of the white space has been deleted from it just to shrink the file's ultimate size, but it is in fact a CSS file. Meanwhile, lower down in this file, if I close my terminal window here, we'll see in the table tag that I've used a class attribute, the value of which is table. Why is this? Well, according to Bootstrap's own documentation, they just told me if I want to use their stylization, their style sheet, be sure to add a class of table to your own HTML table so that they don't presume to change the aesthetics of all of your tables, just the one to which you've added this class. Meanwhile, the documentation also advised me to add scope equals column and scope equals column to two of these table headings up here. But otherwise, the data itself is exactly the same. So let me go back to my browser tab here, which previously looked like this with no CSS whatsoever. And honestly, even if I'd added my own CSS, you've probably been underwhelmed as to how pretty my own pages look. Probably would not have looked much better. But simply by including Bootstrap CSS file and adding those attributes that I pointed out, notice what happens when I now click reload on this newly stylized phone book. Suddenly, it looks much better. Still black and white, so if you were expecting even fancier, you're not going to get it, but it's still black and white. But notice the font is no longer the default. It's no longer some serif font, but it's some sans serif font with less decoration. Notice that name and number have been automatically boldfaced. Notice that clearly there's more padding or spacing among all of these values, so arguably it's easier to read. Notice that there's the gray line separating each of the rows from each other. And long story short, it's just prettier. It's nicer to look at, but you and I don't have to figure out how to adjust the white space, how to adjust the bold facing, how to adjust the font size, and all of that. The library takes care of that for you. Moreover, there's other features you can include here. If I read the documentation, it turns out that I can also add table-striped to the class attribute. So we haven't seen this yet, but it turns out that the class attribute's value can be one word or two or three, so long as they're separated by spaces. So if I read the documentation, turns out I can apply two classes to this table, the second one now being table striped, and watch what happens when I now reload the page. I now see that every other row is very beautifully striped. Slightly more usable, slightly prettier to look at, and maybe more helpful then to discern what data is on what row. And let me wave my hands at the rest of this, but suffice it to say that by way of frameworks like Bootstrap, you can actually make your website faster and better and prettier without having to reinvent lots of wheels yourself. That said, if you're particularly artistically inclined and want to fine-tune things, you can create some or even all of the CSS that you're using. But for more on Bootstrap, all of its documentation is at this URL here. And in fact, in many of CS50's own projects, do we ourselves use Bootstrap and its classes so we don't have to figure out all of the aesthetics thereof. Now, with all that said, just one language remains, this one a proper programming language that, for better or for worse, is going to bring back functions and arguments and loops and conditionals. But before we get there, let's take a 5-minute break. And when we return for the final time, we'll dive into JavaScript. All right, we are back, and we now take a look at the third of our 3 languages today, that of JavaScript, but specifically one that's a programming language. And by programming language, I indeed mean that we'll get functions and arguments and loops and conditionals and more back. But let's take a quick tour through JavaScript, just as we did Python, much more quickly, because what's ultimately important to us today is that you have a sense of what JavaScript can do, but we will really only scratch the surface of this here language. Not only can JavaScript be used in some of the ways we'll see today, but it's also increasingly being used on the server as well to generate entire websites and applications and more. So we'll give you a sense really of some of the basic syntax and basic capabilities, but ultimately defer to your future endeavors, your own final project perhaps, to apply JavaScript and explore it all the more. So just as we did earlier, let's consider the simplest of web pages here in HTML alongside its own DOM, or document object model, which represents, again, how that HTML might be structured in the computer's memory once the page has been downloaded and loaded by the browser. Unfortunately, what you're looking at here is a very static web page, one that simply says hello title and hello body. But wouldn't it be nice if that DOM could evolve over time? After all, in C and then in Python, we experimented with data structures via which we can add and remove data dynamically based on user input and more. In fact, almost any web page you've used nowadays has some form of dynamism involved, such that it's rare for it to be a static website. Odds are something is changing. Case in point, if you open up your Gmail inbox or Outlook inbox and just sit there staring at it, odds are, for better or for worse, more email will appear. More email will appear. And previously, we described those kinds of inboxes as stacks, which they rather are underneath the hood. But visually, how are those stacks of emails being implemented in HTML? Well, we've seen already that it's probably some form of tabular data, a bunch of TRs, 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 one for each email that you might receive. But if it's coming from the server once, how can you possibly get more emails? So long story short, thanks to server-side technologies, Python among them, and client-side languages like JavaScript among them, can you actually, behind the scenes, get more and more data from the server in order to update the web page and in turn the underlying DOM. So how can we go about doing this? Well, let's see what some of the things are that JavaScript can do. We have conditionals in JavaScript, whereby, such as in Scratch, when we had x less than y as a Boolean expression, in JavaScript here at right, that kind of code is now going to look like this. Unfortunately, the parentheses are back, the curly braces are sometimes back, but this is perhaps the simplest way to think about the structure of a JavaScript version of a conditional. It actually looks, at a glance, exactly like C. If we consider an if-else in Scratch here, at right now with JavaScript would be exactly the same, just as we saw, in fact, in C. And similarly, if we have an if, else if, else if, that too might look exactly like this. But unlike Python, which rather abbreviated else if, in JavaScript and in C, it is else if with a space in between. All right, what about variables in JavaScript if you actually want to be able to store something in your own variables? Well, in Scratch, recall that we might have set a counter equal to an initial value of 0 like this. In JavaScript, there's a few ways to do it, but the simplest way to describe this is by using a new keyword, let, which is like a very polite way of asking the browser to give you a variable. Let me have a variable called counter and initialize it to a value of 0. Semicolons, though, are now back. Now, that's a bit of an overstatement because JavaScript can actually tolerate the absence of semicolons, at least in many cases. However, for consistency, we and I will continue to use them here. How about if you want to increment that counter by a value of 1? Well, in JavaScript, you can do this by setting counter equals to counter plus 1, the equal sign being, of course, our assignment operator from right to left. You could also do counter plus equals 1, just as in C and in Python. And if you like this in C, plus plus and minus minus are now back. So in JavaScript, you can do that to increment or decrement a variable respectively. What about loops? Well, in Scratch, we might have had something like this to repeat 3 times. In JavaScript, it similarly is going to be very similar to C. But instead of saying something like int for integer in C, we indeed say let in JavaScript to create a variable like I. Do this, say, 3 times while incrementing with plus plus I along the way. What else might we now do? Well, we might have a forever block here in Scratch that does something, of course, forever. In JavaScript, you can also say while true, where true is back to being lowercase here, and that will ensure that whatever's between those curly braces will happen again and again. Meanwhile, if we revisit the canonical form of this HTML, where can we actually put JavaScript code? Turns out there's a few different places, and there's a few different reasons to use one place or another. But just so that you see in the range of possibilities, especially when you then see suggestions in online documentation for JavaScript libraries, you can put a script tag in the head of your page, just like we put a style tag or a link tag up there as well as the title. And inside of that can go some raw JavaScript code typed out by you. Of course, I've proposed that it tends not to be ideal to commingle one language with another, and so there's other ways to do this too. You can actually have a script tag, this one with a source element that will allow you to specify another file name or even another URL from which you want the JavaScript itself to come. What's a little weird, though, about the script tag here, even when used with a source attribute, is that you'll see that I've closed the tag nonetheless with an open bracket / script close bracket tag at the end of this line to make clear that there's no JavaScript inside of this element. Indeed, it's only coming from that same source. As an aside, you will also see, and there are also reasons too, sometimes put a script tag in the body of the page that is below most everything else in the page, or a script tag with a file reference therein, even at the bottom of the page, just because order of operations can indeed matter. But these are sort of subtleties that we'll try to avoid for now, simply focusing on really what JavaScript itself can do. And in fact, what's perhaps most powerful about JavaScript, and what nicely brings us rather full circle back to where we started the class in Scratch, JavaScript, in the context of browsers, can be very much event-driven. So just like in Scratch, when we actually had actual events, and even a block, if you discovered it, called broadcast, where you could have one sprite somehow signal to another, in JavaScript, and specifically in the context of browsers, there's just so many events or things that can happen. For instance, you might change the value of a field in a form. You might give something focus by clicking on a text box. You might drag something from one place to another. You might put your mouse down or mouse over something. On a mobile device, you might put a finger down, thereby touching down on the device. So long story short, all of these keywords that you see here represent events that happen inside of a browser that JavaScript as a language can be used to listen for and respond to. And as such, you can use JavaScript to make very interactive and responsive web pages, whether that's to go get more emails from the server or to grab more of a map if you're clicking and dragging while using Google Maps or the like. So let's begin to scratch the surface today only of what JavaScript can do. Let me go back to VS Code here. Let me create a new file here called hello.html. And in that file, I'm going to go ahead and save a few steps by first copying as a starting point some of my earlier code. Let me close my terminal window, change my title as always to just hello, and get rid of now that default body. And let's go ahead and whip up a very simple interactive page that just says hello to someone more interactively, ideally letting them type in their own name, just as we've done in so many languages prior. Let me go ahead and create a form tag in here. And inside of that form, let's give myself an input. And just to practice what I've been preaching, let's turn autocomplete off as before. Let's turn on autofocus so I don't have to click in it manually. Let's give this input a unique identifier for reasons that we'll soon see, like name, although I could call this thing anything I want, but I do want the person's name. Let me use the placeholder text of name so it's clear to the user what I'm prompting them for. And the type of this text box, even though this is the default, shall indeed be text. What else do I want to do? Well, let's keep it simple and just have an input type equals submit so that I get a button, which you've seen in a couple of different ways. Let me go back to my other tab, reload the page, and I'll see now hello.html. Inside of this file, I see a very simple form. If I type in my name, though, and click submit, notice that my URL has changed if I zoom in up here, and there's indeed a question mark, which suggests that something was submitted from the browser to the server, but there's nothing after that. There's no something equals something. And why is that? Well, even though I gave the text box an ID of name, I didn't give the text field a name itself. In other words, I did not say, if confusingly, name equals quote unquote name, just as I did name equals quote unquote queue or name equals quote unquote email. And that's fine, because we've certainly seen inputs before that don't actually send anything to the server. They just result, for instance, in the case of a button, in the form itself being submitted. So this is to say that if an input in a form does not have a name, it's simply not going to be submitted to the server. But that's OK, because my goal at hand today, at least for this example, is to say hello to the user, but not server side. We don't yet have the means yet, until we reintroduce some Python to generate content server side. I want to do everything client side. And so just to be clear, just as HTML is downloaded from the server to the browser, CSS is downloaded from the server to the browser, JavaScript, as we are currently using it, will also be downloaded from the server to the browser and executed client side in your own Mac, your PC, or your phone. Which is to say that any of the data we get from the server has to come all at the get-go. Until then, it gets executed client side. So if I want to greet the user based on what they type in their name as, I need my client-side JavaScript code to go grab that name from the form and display it on the screen for me. So how can I do this? Well, it turns out that the form element can take another attribute that we've not yet used that's actually reminiscent of those keywords on this list here. Indeed, notice on this list is a submit event. And indeed, in HTML, I can use an onSubmit attribute in my code to do most anything I want. For instance, suppose I want to call a function. I'm going to call a function called greet. However, I don't want this actual form to be submitted. I actually want to return false here as well after a semicolon, just to make clear that what I want this form to do is no longer to submit to the server, but rather greet the user by calling some function called greet, and then return false. And return false, per the documentation for how browsers and JavaScript works, just means that the form never goes to the server. So how can I go about using this here code? Now, this greet function doesn't actually come with JavaScript, but I can create it myself, just as I could create functions in Scratch, in C, and in Python. In fact, let me go up to the head of the page and keep things simple, create a script tag in there above my title, and then inside of that script tag, let's go about defining a function in JavaScript. It's a little different from C, it's a little different from Python, but the end result is really the same. In JavaScript, you literally write the keyword function, which means, hey, browser, here comes a new function. You then give that function a name. I'll call it greet. You then specify in parentheses whether or not that function takes any arguments. And for now, I'm going to say no, none. And then inside of curly braces, I can implement the actual function. Well, what do I want to actually greet the user with? Anything for now. Let's keep it simple. Let's actually use JavaScript's built-in function called alert and just say something like, how about hello, comma, world, close quote, semicolon. So the alert function, unlike greet, does come with the language. Here, I'm going to go back to my browser, reload the page, type in DAVID, and now I'm going to click submit. And notice what happens. I now get a fairly ugly pop-up, which is built into the browser itself, but toward the middle of it, it indeed says hello, comma, world. Now, that has nothing to do with the name I typed in, but we can fix that. Let me click OK. Go back to VS Code, and before I say hello world, let's do this. Let's create a variable called name and set it equal to the following function, though it's admittedly a mouthful. Document dot query selector quote unquote hash name dot value semicolon. There's a lot to unpack here. So what's going on? Well, recall that from Python, you can chain certain things together. And recall from C and Python, you can use the dot operator to go inside of structures or objects. So that's a lot of what's going on here. So it turns out there's a special global variable when using JavaScript in a browser called document, which refers to the document itself, the DOM, if you will. And if you go inside of the document, it comes with a method, aka function, called query selector, capital S, lowercase q. And what query selector lets you use, funny enough, is the exact same syntax that CSS uses to select elements. So you can select elements in the page by way of their name or type, like body or header or main or footer. You can select elements by way of classes or by way of their IDs or other techniques as well. Now recall earlier that I did give this HTML input an ID of quote unquote name. And so if I want to refer to that ID, recall from CSS that the symbol is the hash symbol and then the name of that identifier. So what's happening here is I'm saying go into the document, use the query selector method, look for the element whose unique ID is name, and please grab its value. That is whatever the human typed into that input, and store it from right to left in a variable called name. Now all I have to do is include it in my alert to the user. And just as in Python, there's different ways to do this. What I'm going to go ahead and do first is our old friend, the plus operator, after a space inside quotes, and append to or concatenate to hello, comma, space, that person's name. Now notice too, what I've deliberately done here is the following. In the world of C, double quotes are what you use for strings and single quotes are what you use for characters. In the world of Python, double quotes or single quotes can be used for strings, otherwise known as strs. In JavaScript, same thing is true. Double quotes or single quotes. I will say conventionally, probably most JavaScript programmers use single quotes for better or for worse for strings. So that's the habit I'm going to adopt here, if only to be consistent with that. Let me now go back to my other browser page, reload, type in again my name, David, and notice now when I click submit, now I get, if I zoom in, hello, comma, David. So I've created a string there dynamically. Notice too, once I dismiss this by clicking OK, if I go back up to the URL bar, notice that I have not actually submitted the form. No question mark, no key value pairs have appeared in the URL. All of this is indeed happening client side. Now, what more can I now do with this? Well, this arguably is not the best design because as before with CSS, I'm kind of commingling one language with another. And I've kind of baked into my HTML some very explicit JavaScript code. Can I get rid of this? Well, I can in fact do that in a couple of different ways. Let's go ahead and do this. Let me go ahead and get rid of the onSubmit stuff, leaving therefore just the form and the two inputs inside of it that I had previously. Just to avoid a problem, let me go below this now and add a script tag after getting rid of this one up here. So I'm going to deliberately move everything to the bottom of the page for now, just so that this works without creating a problem. And what am I now going to do? Well, it turns out in JavaScript, you can actually use JavaScript to query the DOM for specific elements and then listen to events that might happen with those elements. You don't need an onSubmit attribute. You can do all of this in code. So how might I do this? Well, let me do this. Let me create a JavaScript variable called form, set it equal to document.querySelector, and then let me go ahead and select the one and only form in my page with quote unquote form. I don't need a hash symbol. I don't need a dot because I'm selecting that element by its type or its name, which in this case is form. All right, what can I now do with this variable? I can now use form dot and a new method that we haven't yet seen. It turns out in a web page, once you have a variable or some other value that represents an element on the page, you can call a method called addEventListener. And as the name implies, that allows you, after the page has been created, to start listening for some special event on that element. That event being drawn from a list like this one here, including the submit event. So how can I do this? Well, this function takes one argument, which is quote unquote the type of event that you want to listen for. And I could listen for any number of things, but the one that's relevant for a text box in this case, or one that's relevant for a form with this text box is going to be quote unquote submit. And then I can call a function that actually gets called whenever that form is submitted. Now, greet, again, does not yet exist because I deleted it earlier. But notice what's happening here, which is not something we've done much before, except a little bit in Python. I am calling the form variables addEventListener function, aka method. I'm telling it to please add an event listener on the submit event. And whenever that event is fired or triggered, please call this function greet. So I'm passing in the name of the function. I am not using parentheses after the name of this function because I don't want to call greet now. I want to register greet as an event listener, so to speak, so it's called later by its name by the browser for me. Now, how can I go about implementing greet? I can do something as before. So above this code, so before I use it, let's say function greet, open paren, close paren. Then inside of this function, let's do something similar to before. Let name equals document.querySelector, quote unquote, hash name to get at the element with that unique name, with that unique ID, dot value. And below that, let's go ahead and use our alert function saying again, hello, comma, space, plus to use the concatenation operator, that particular name. Now, there's one other thing I do want to do here, because by default, when forms are submitted, they indeed get submitted to the server, but that's behavior that we wanted to preempt. The way we prevented that last time was by adding return false inside of the event handler. But there's actually a better way to do that. It turns out that when adding an event listener using a function called greet, you're actually going to be passed in an argument, whether you want it or not, that I can refer to as event, or E for short, but I'll be more explicit with event. And it turns out that that argument that gets automatically passed in for you whenever that event is triggered allows you to call event.preventDefault, which is a more programmatic, less hackish way than previously, whereby I just returned false. This is literally telling the browser, when you get this event, let me do my own thing by alerting the user, hello so-and-so, but prevent the default behavior, which we know now to be submitting the form itself. So if I haven't made any mistakes here, and I go back to my browser, reload this page, type in DAVID again, and click submit, there we have it again. the browser has shown me hello, comma, David. But this is getting a little verbose, honestly. And in fact, there's more JavaScript-like ways to do things like this. And let me propose to do this. Notice that I am, one, using a variable called name here, and then only using it in one place. That's totally fine and very reasonable, but we know from C and Python that's not strictly necessary. So if you're more comfortable, you can get rid of that whole variable, like such, and then just concatenate to hello, comma, space, the return value of that same function. Now, this fits on the screen nicely. It's still pretty readable. I would wager that this is reasonably well designed, but if this line of code got much longer, we probably do want to go back to the version with an actual variable. But we still want to prevent the default. But what about this line here? Notice that I'm calling a function called greet, even though I'm only doing that once. So we can actually do something in JavaScript that's kind of neat that we can't quite do in the same way in C or in Python, at least not nearly as elegantly. It turns out that if I'm only using the function greet once, I don't really need to give this function a name. In fact, let me just kind of get rid of that there and get rid of this here. And let me propose this. This will look ugly at first, but I'm going to grab this whole function and I'm going to literally copy and paste it as the second argument to add event listener. I'm going to go ahead and clean it up a little bit to be a little conventional here. I'm going to move my curly brace to this line. I'm going to get rid of this space. But now, this is actually pretty compact. Let me get rid of some of the blank lines. And notice what I'm now doing. I'm still using a variable called form to get the one form in the page. I'm then telling that form to add an event listener for the submit event. But because I want to tell it what function to call, what you can do in JavaScript, which you can actually do in Python too, is you can pass in an anonymous function, otherwise known as a lambda function, that still might take an argument, but does not need a name. Why? Because if you're using it only one place, why bother even giving it a name? So the only thing I've done is I've deleted the name greet and simply calling it function and then passing in specifying the argument it should take. But the next two lines are exactly the same. And the only thing you have to be careful about is, notice I've got the close curly brace here and then the close parenthesis, the first of which closes this curly brace, the second of which closes this first parenthesis. And if you really want to tighten things up, we don't really need the form variable. Let me get rid of that line of code and change that variable to be this one-liner. And so even though this is getting a little complicated visually for those unfamiliar with JavaScript, this is fairly conventional syntax for doing a whole lot of things at once in this particular language without unnecessarily using variables and the like. Now, let me demonstrate that still this here works. If I reload the page and type in my name, David, and submit, we do get that pop-up. But let me do what I did previously, which was to put this whole script tag inside of my head tag at the top of the page. So I'll make room for it up there. Same exact code, but now the script tag is above the form tag. Let me go back to my browser here, click reload, type in DAVID, and click submit. And dang it, we're somehow back to the broken version, where still my name, because I added that name attribute earlier, is getting submitted to the server, but I don't want this getting submitted to the server. What is now going wrong? Well, let's see if we can't diagnose this. Let me go back. Let me right-click or control-click and inspect and show you one final tab today, which is that of the JavaScript console. It turns out that in the console tab of your developer tools, you can see error messages from languages like JavaScript. And if you see anything red like this, odds are, I'm afraid, you messed up. Or in this case, I messed up. And let's see if we can infer what's wrong. Cannot read properties of null reading add event listener. Unfortunately, just like Clang, just like Python, the error messages in the computer world are not always that clear, especially for first-time programmers. But it at least seems to relate to line 7, character 43 of hello.html. So let's go back to this line here. Line 7 here is in place. Why might the form be null? Well, notice that this global variable here is referring to the whole document. Query selector is selecting some element from that document. But if that element doesn't yet exist, this function call here, which I've highlighted, will return null. So this is kind of like saying null.eventListener, which just like our time from C, kind of makes no sense. You can't dereference null. You can't do anything with null. So something has gone wrong. Now, why is that? Well, much like Python, much like C, these languages are typically read top to bottom, left to right. And unfortunately, if you define the form on line 16, but you try to access the form on line 7, it's just not going to work. And so what you're seeing in JavaScript's console here is that it's null because it hasn't yet been read. Now, previously, I avoided that problem by moving the whole script tag to the bottom of the page, just sort of avoiding the problem. But there is another way to do it. And you'll see in lots of libraries, even though it's a bit of a mouthful. Let me go into hello.html here and add one more event listener, which I'll type out myself. Document.add event listener. And I'm going to listen for a very special event that you have to capitalize just right. DOM content loaded, quote unquote. And then I'm going to go ahead and call another anonymous function that simply does all of this stuff together. At the very bottom of what I just added, I'm going to add another, I'm going to add the close curly brace and another close parenthesis to now close this curly brace up here that I just added and this parenthesis here that I just added. So this too is more of a mouthful, but what is DOM content loaded? I mean, it kind of does what it says. When the DOM's content, the entirety of it has been loaded, then can you go ahead and execute these lines of code. How do you know what lines of code to execute? Well, here too, I've defined an anonymous function in JavaScript, which just allows me to contain inside of these curly braces the lines of code that I want to execute. Not now, but eventually, when the DOM's content has loaded. So this is to say that even in these simplistic examples we've seen already, JavaScript very heavily tends to use these anonymous functions. Or really, people who write JavaScript code tend to heavily use these anonymous functions, if only because it tightens things up. And typically, once you have some experience with programming in this or other languages, you'll get more and more familiar with this. Even though at a glance, for the first time, this admittedly looks way more complicated than the problem it's actually trying to solve. Now, that said, just like with CSS, we can get rid of all of this stuff. Let me highlight and cut that out. Let me delete all these new lines. Let me go into my script tag and let me pretend for the moment with a source attribute that I have a file called scripts.js. And I could imagine now going into a file called scripts.js, pasting all of the code I just cut out of this file, and then just like CSS, allowing one file to refer to the other. So in other words, you can ultimately go ahead and implement that same paradigm of separating one language from another in JavaScript as well. All right. That was a lot, but let's now focus not so much on writing as much code like this, but looking at some examples that I brought with me to demonstrate what more we can do with JavaScript. In my terminal window, let me go ahead and grab a 5th version of this file from my source 8 directory. That's going to look a little something like this. In hello.html now, which I wrote in advance this time, we have some very similar code such that I'm listening for the DOM content to be loaded. I am defining a variable, in this case called input, because I wanted to find a textbooks on the page. And I'm using another event listener. And we've seen it on this here list, not just submit, but for instance, key up, when the human's finger comes up from the keyboard just after having typed something. Let's see for the moment, before we dive in further to how this event is being used, what this page now looks like. If I close my developer tools and reload the page, notice that the submit button is gone, but I still have a text box. And watch what happens when I start typing like the letter C, or A, or T, or if I delete, W-O-R-L-D, delete. And then there's a default value here as well. So notice now it's sort of automatically updating the DOM of the page as I'm typing. In fact, let me do this. Let me reopen my developer tools with inspect. Let me go to the elements page by default and notice the P tag here. At the moment in the browser's memory is the phrase hello, comma, whoever you are. Let me start to type my own name now instead of cat or world or anything else, D. And notice that not only am I seeing hello, comma, D on the screen, notice that the DOM, as represented by the Elements tab, has been dynamically updated as well. If I type in now an A, notice what happens in both places too. The DOM gets updated again. VID, notice that, and it's flashing to draw your eye to it. I'm updating the DOM in memory. Meanwhile, if I close this and open up the page source, recall that this is a static version in here. There is no mention of DAVID in the actual HTML. That's coming from me, the user. So if we go back now to VS Code, let's look at how this works. Again, on line 10, I created a variable called input that just uses query selector to find the input element, the text box. Then I registered an event listener on that text box for key up. So this thing responds as soon as the finger comes off the key. I want this function anonymously to be called whenever that key goes up. Inside of this function, define a variable called name, and I use the query selector to get another element on the page called p. Well, where did that come from? Well, let me open the page source again. And notice at the bottom of the page is not only the form, which is super simple, no submit button even, but there's also an empty paragraph tag that I just put there as a default element to fill with my content. Let me go back to VS Code here and notice that once I've got that, I've got room for the person's name. So what I'm going to do is this. If the input has a value, if the text box has something typed in, I'm going to do this. I'm going to go inside of that name, the so-called paragraph. I'm going to change its inner HTML. Capitalization is important here. Lowercase inner, all caps HTML. And I'm going to change it to be hello, comma, something. More on that in a moment. Else, if there's no input value, that is, it's blank, so this Boolean expression is false, let's just change the inner HTML to be hello, comma, whoever you are. That's the default value. The last thing to tease apart then is what is going on here. This is horrible to look at, I will admit, and is the ugliest of the syntax we've seen. But just like in Python, we have those format strings or F strings where you can put the F and then quote marks and then curly braces inside to interpolate the value of some variable. JavaScript has something similar, except it's much more ugly to look at. Specifically, you use backticks, which vary in their location based on whether you have a US English keyboard or something else, but a backtick at the beginning and a backtick at the end. And inside of those backticks, if you want to interpolate the value of some variable, you do use curly braces, but you also use a dollar sign. So it's like Python syntax, but worse. But it's the exact same idea. There's nothing really complicated beyond that other than remembering or Googling the syntax for that technique. So at the end of the day, the result is that we get this sort of automatically updating page that updates one keystroke at a time based on what the user typed in, this time based specifically on the key up event instead of submit. Well, let's do one other. Let me go back to VS Code here, open up my terminal after closing hello.html. Let me copy from my source directory today something called background.html. And now let's go back to my directory listing here, reload, and see background.html and click it. This is very simple, but let's see if we can infer how this works. I've got 3 buttons, and they're not rectangular as much as they are square, but that's just because the labels R, G, and B are so short. But watch what happens. R turns my background red. Green turns it green. B turns it blue. Well, how is that happening? Well, let me go back to VS Code here, and let me actually open now this file, background.html, and notice what's going on here. Inside of my body, I've got 3 buttons, each of which has a unique ID, red, green, or blue, and each of which has super short labels, R, G, and B, in all caps. But then I have a script tag. Notice first I'm creating a variable called body that's just grabbing the element from the page, the type of which is body, and there's only one of those. And then notice this, I've got 3 nearly identical lines of code starting here. I'm going into the document using query selector to find whatever element has a unique ID of red, per the hash symbol. On that element, I'm adding an event listener for the click event, which is again on our list of events that you can listen for in JavaScript, in addition to submit and in addition to key up. Here then, I'm listening for click, and I'm calling this anonymous function when that R button is clicked. And when it is, I execute one line of code. And here's where today kind of comes together in full circle. I can, inside of my web page, using JavaScript, modify the CSS of my page too. I can go into that body element, access its style attribute, which is a variable inside of the body, and that exists because that's how browsers work. And I can access the background color property inside of that body tag style. It's like accessing its style attribute, if you will. And I can set it equal to quote unquote red. Or I could do hash ff0000, but I kept it simple with quote unquote red. The next 3 lines of code are the same thing, but for green. The last 3 lines are the same thing, but for blue. The only thing that's weird here is where did background color come from? Because it's lowercase b and capital C. Unfortunately, this is maybe not the best design historically. In CSS, we saw text align, we saw color, we saw a couple of other properties as well. Unfortunately, there is in CSS a CSS property called background-color. I just didn't happen to use it just yet. Unfortunately, CSS uses background-color. JavaScript necessarily uses background color with capital C. Why? Well, in JavaScript, you can do math, like in most languages, and unfortunately, the dash is already used as a minus sign. So unfortunately, in JavaScript, if you wrote this property as background-color, this would be like trying to subtract color from background. So background minus color, which makes no sense. So left hand and right hand weren't really communicating, it seems. So the solution was just to use camel case, so to speak, like a camel with a hump, and capitalize the C, but get rid of the hyphen. And there is a mapping, therefore, from CSS properties to JavaScript attributes in this way. So that's all that's happening. And in fact, we can see this again in our inspector. Let me reload the page to go back to white. Let me again open up the developer tools. Let me click on the body of the page, which currently has no attributes. And at right, there's no styles being applied to it other than the defaults from the user agent style sheet. But watch what happens now under element.style and on the body tag itself. When I click R, a style attribute will suddenly appear programmatically on the body tag with a value corresponding to background-color, red. Notice over at right here, too, we see a summary in Chrome's developer tools of exactly that. If I click on G, if I click on B, I can see exactly the same thing happening for each of those colors. So here now, we have the ability with JavaScript not only to alter the DOM of the page, the contents of it, what the user is seeing, but also it would seem the CSS thereof. What more can we do? Well, let's look at one other example that sort of evokes a tag from yesteryear. Let me go into my source directory and grab an example called blink.html. and show you in this code herein. If I hide my terminal window, we've got a function in this file inside of my script tag called blink, which apparently toggles visibility of greeting. But what does that mean? Well, let's try to infer here. There's a variable called body, which is set equal to the return value of query selector. And we're checking this question. If the visibility of that element is hidden, then change the visibility to visible. Else, change the visibility to hidden. Now, this too is one of these left hand and right hand. We're not intercommunicating. I have no idea why the opposite of visible is not invisible, but the opposite of visible in CSS is hidden, for better or for worse. So what's really happening here is we have a conditional, an if-else construct, that's saying if the visibility is hidden, make it visible, but if it's visible, make it hidden, back or forth. How is this being used? Well, here is another function that comes with JavaScript. There's a global variable called window, which refers to the browser window itself. That comes with a method called setInterval, capital I. That function takes two arguments, the first of which is the name of a function to call. Notice again, not using parentheses, because I don't want to call blink on line 22. I want to pass the name of that blink function to this setInterval function. And 500 is the second argument. That refers to a number of milliseconds. And what setInterval does, as you might imagine, is it will now call the blink function every 500 milliseconds, or half a second. So the effect, if I go back to my browser tab, close my developer tools, and click now on blink.html, is a resurrection of a tag that actually existed when I was growing up, whereby you could literally do open bracket blink, close bracket, and you could make your web page's text blink like this. Even worse, there was a tag called marquee that would scroll your text across the screen, very hideously so. And in fact, among all of the features of HTML, among the few that have been removed over the years are exactly those two tags. But with JavaScript, we can bring them back now in this way. The point of which really is to demonstrate again how much control we now have over over our DOM and our web pages thanks to JavaScript. Let's do one final example here. Let's go back to VS Code here, open my terminal, and let me copy in one last file from today's distribution code called autocomplete.html. And let's go ahead and open up autocomplete.html here in VS Code. Well, what's going on here? Well, it turns out that there's a body of this page which just has a text input that's of type text with a placeholder of query. Below that, there's this empty unordered list with nothing initially, much like there was an empty paragraph tag previously, so I could put hello so-and-so. Then there's this file here using a script tag referencing large.js. So I actually need that file too. That's in today's distribution too. So let me grab large.js, which, if we open that up, might look somewhat familiar. It is a JavaScript version of the dictionary from problem set 5, wherein you implemented the fastest spell checker that you could. So there's 100,000 plus words in this file, but notice they're structured as a JavaScript variable called words, all caps, to make clear that I mean for it to be global. It's using square brackets, as on line 1, because that, it turns out, much like Python, is how JavaScript indicates an array. But in JavaScript, they're again called arrays instead of lists. And then I just have this comma-separated list of strings using double quotes, but I could have used single quotes for all 100,000 plus of those words. So by including this file, this means that my script down here has access to that words variable. What am I doing? Well, I'd create a variable called input and set it equal to query selector's return value just so I can get a variable pointing to that text box. Then I'm again, as before, adding an event listener, listening for key up, so the finger coming up, and whenever that happens, I call this anonymous function. I first, in that function, set an HTML variable to quote unquote, so the empty string, nothing. Because what I want to do is build up a list of words that match whatever the human has typed in. And you'll perhaps see where this is going in a moment. If the user then has typed something in, there's a value in that text box, do this. Iterate over that array of words. So for each word of words. Here too is a JavaScript specific feature, but it's similar in spirit to Python, sort of similar in spirit to C, but the preposition I'm using is indeed of. And I'm saying for each of the words of this words array, it's a little weird, the English, but this is how you can iterate over every element in a JavaScript array. If the current word that we're iterating over starts with capital W, so this is a function that comes with strings in JavaScript, that input value. So in other words, if the word we're looking at in the dictionary starts with the same letters that the human has typed into the text box, let's do this. Let's concatenate onto the HTML variable, which is just an empty string initially, the following HTML. Now this too looks weird, but remember that the backticks mean that you can interpolate variables inside of curly braces. So this means add to that HTML variable another li tag and another close li tag, inside of which though is the word that has matched the first few characters. And do that again and again and again. And plus equals here just means concatenate, concatenate, concatenate. So we're essentially building up in JavaScript more and more and more and more HTML dynamically based on the human's keystrokes. And the very last thing I do is this. I ask the document to query select the UL element, which previously was an empty unordered list, but change its inner HTML to be equal to the li tags that I've been creating in one big variable. So if I go back over to VS Code here, if I go back to my browser tab here and click back, and I now go into autocomplete.html, as the name suggests, this is the essence of how autocomplete exists in Google, in Bing, and in applications more generally on the web and in some mobile devices. If I type in C, I see now an unordered list of all of the words that start with C in this dictionary. If I type A, nothing seems to happen, but that's because the list is so long. If I type CAT, now notice I get every word that starts with CAT. If I type in S, now I get just 4 words, including ketchup at the end, that starts with CATS. Meanwhile, if I open up the web page's source, notice none of those words are in there. They're in the large.js file, but not in this page. If I instead close that and open up the inspector again, and I go to the Elements tab, and after having typed in cats, notice there are indeed 4 li elements there. But watch what happens. As soon as I delete mention of cats here, all 4 of those li's disappear. And now I'm back to the UL alone. So this is to say, with HTML, we can structure our web pages. With CSS, we can stylize our web pages. And with JavaScript, we can dynamically update and modify our web pages. And via JavaScript, can we therefore implement applications like Gmail and Google itself and CS50.ai and so much more, because it makes what's otherwise a very static experience in the browser suddenly dynamic. And indeed, what JavaScript can even do is make more HTTP calls to the server to get more and more data, more and more tiles from a map, more and more emails from the server. But today, we've seen just the fundamentals. Through your coming problem sets and perhaps final project, where you have an opportunity to apply all three of these technologies together to build the web applications and the mobile applications that you and I already use every day. That's it for CS50. We will see you next time.